Hello, my name is Seth Arens, and today I think, Katie gave a great introduction, actually both of those talks, to thinking about ecological succession in desert riparian communities, and then also thinking of that comment that Ken Slight made about, these places are never truly forgotten until people stop talking about them. Well, ultimately, I'm going to be talking about some of those places that were forgotten because they've been under Lake Powell for many years, but now are not under Lake Powell. So first, just a little context about the changes that have been happening in the Lake Powell region. The image on the left is from 2011 when Lake Powell was at a relatively high elevation. Image on the right, 11 years later, is when Lake Powell was at a relatively low elevation. That represents a difference of about 115 feet in surface elevation of Lake Powell. So you can see by 2011, Lake Powell is dried. There's less water, there's more land surface out. And I want to stress that this 180-foot drop in Lake Powell elevation that occurred from the year 2000 to 2023, it wasn't caused by a single factor. It was caused by the combination of water use, just how we use water in the Colorado Basin and the West, drought, and climate change. We would not have seen a drop this dramatic in Lake Powell if it weren't for the fact that all three of those factors were working in concert. And the thing that I want to stress is what's happening on that land surface that used to be under Lake Powell. And it's not this tiny fractional area, it's actually a huge amount of land. When Lake Powell hit its lowest elevation in April 2023, there was over 100,000 acres of land that was now a terrestrial landscape and had previously been inundated by Lake Powell. So I've been working on kind of a cobbled together 4-year study in the Lake Powell region in Glen Canyon. I'll be referring to this landscape really for the most part as Glen Canyon. Glen Canyon was the canyon that was submerged by Glen Canyon Dam. With Lake Powell being so low, many of these features and landscapes of Glen Canyon are reemerging. So while there's really quite a few interesting ecological questions to be asked in this region, thinking about ecological succession, how these plants and plant communities are reestablishing, really this study focuses on some basic questions. And that is solely because there's been no research done in this landscape on these emerging landscapes. So some of the questions I'm focusing on for this study are what plants and ecosystems are establishing on emerging landscapes, how similar are emerging landscapes to never flooded ecosystems, and how do these ecosystems change over time? So in year 1 and year 2 of this project, I established 88 plant survey sites in 22 locations. I really focused this study on tributary canyons, and particularly tributary canyons with some amount of flowing water, either perennially flowing water or water flowing for much of the year, either from springs or snowmelt. However, I did have sites in some drying bay locations. All of these green dots represent the 22 locations in Glen Canyon, really focused on kind of central to upper Glen Canyon. Primarily, that's just due for logistics for me. I'm based out of Salt Lake City, and Bullfrog Marina is really the easiest access point for me. And you can get to the greatest number of tributary canyons, kind of efficiently from that point. And for the purpose of this talk, while none of these sites were in Escalante Grand Staircase National Monument, they were all in Glen Canyon NRA. I want to stress that 32 of these sites really are in this Escalante region, including sites along the Escalante River, Cow and Explorer Canyons, Willow Gulch, 50 Mile Canyon, Reflection Canyon, and Cottonwood Gulch. So I want to walk you through general experimental design of this project. The Google Earth image here shows Willow Gulch. All the way on the left of the image is Willow Gulch's confluence with the Escalante River. Actually, it's the Escalante Arm in this picture because that confluence is underwater. In each tributary canyon, I would establish 5 plant survey sites. 2 of those were located at elevations above 3,700 feet. And I want to stop here for a minute because I use this number 3,700 feet and refer to both above and below 3,700 feet quite a bit. This elevation is very significant in this region because 3,700 feet is the high water elevation of Lake Powell. Lake Powell did not rise above 3,700 feet. So in thinking about impacts of Lake Powell drying, I'm using these sites above 3,700 feet as control sites. Now, they aren't perfect controls that I can go into a little bit later, but those sites I'm often comparing to sites below 3,700 feet. Typically, I had 3 experimental sites below 3,700 feet, and these sites were at specific target elevations, and those target elevations relate to landscape age, which I'll get into in a minute. So now I want to give you an idea of how changes in Lake Powell elevation relate across this landscape. This blue line here represents the extent of Lake Powell when it was at its full pool elevation of 3,700 feet, flooding 5 miles of Willow Gulch. When I visited this site in May 2023, shortly after the lake's low point, as the lake was coming up during runoff season 2023, Lake Powell extended 1 mile up Willow Gulch, leaving 4 miles of this tributary canyon exposed since 1999. Now, I want to stop here for a minute and focus on this concept of landscape age and how that relates across the landscape. So elevation, when you're at an elevation below 3,700 feet in these tributary canyons, your elevation is directly related to the age of that landscape. What I mean by the age of that landscape is how long that piece of land has been out from under Lake Powell. So essentially, when the land comes out from under Lake Powell, it is this blank slate. Yes, it was a terrestrial landscape at one point, but there are no plants, and it's completely filled smooth with sediment that's been deposited by Lake Powell in many locations. So when you're walking up a tributary canyon from Lake Powell, it's like walking back in successional time. Now, what I mean by that is with thinking about this concept of ecological succession, how plants and ecosystems establish and replace one another as time goes on across a landscape. You're walking to older and older systems as you're walking up these tributary canyons. So the landscape is older, and the kinds of plants, the groups of plants, and the size and density of plants is changing as you're walking upstream. However, this doesn't happen in a smooth time step. It happens in these specific jumps in time that relate to years where there's specific high water marks of Lake Powell. And because we have detailed records of the elevation of Lake Powell, if I know my elevation, I know how old this landscape is. And so in 2023, this is how that landscape age played out in these tributary canyons or drying bays, where you have areas of land that have been out for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 6 years, 12 years, and then 22 to 25 years. So for this project, briefly, just the kind of actual work, the kind of data that was collected, I used a stratified random site selection to select these sites, meaning I had these target elevations that I went to, but then once I went to this site, I'd use like a random number generator, walk that many feet downstream, and then lay a transect tape perpendicular to the flow of the creek. At wherever that happened, it might be kind of an open area, it might be the most heinous, thick, willow stand or dying tamarisk stand, and that's where these transects would be. Now, along these transects, I would set up 16 1x1 meter plots, and in each plot, I would estimate plant cover down to the vascular plant species. These sites were initially sampled in 2022 and 23, and they were resurveyed in 2024, and I'll finish resurveying these this coming May. I also collected a set of repeat photography to track qualitative changes over time, much in the same way Katie was just describing in her previous talk. And I've also been working with an ecologist who's been out with me on many of these trips that's been taking increment cores of tree species. Peter Brown from the Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research has been taking these cores, and this allows an understanding of how old are some of the major tree species, certainly cottonwoods, sometimes Gooding willow, sometimes it may be hackberry, above 3,700 feet. And then it also gives us the age that trees are establishing below 3,700 feet. I won't present any of those data here, but generally trees like cottonwoods and Gooding's willow, they're establishing within a couple years after that land emerges, on the order of 2 to 5 years after. So now I'm just gonna briefly go through a couple slides of data to give you a sense of what's actually happening on this landscape. And there are a couple ways to do this. I'm gonna start in kind of the most general way. So that is comparing total mean cover of all vascular plants to native cover of vascular plants and non-native cover of vascular plants. So from a management perspective, I think it's really relevant to think about native and non-native plants, and also with thinking about ecological succession. These are an important way and distinction to look at plants. And throughout the next couple slides, I'm also comparing sites. These are plots that are above 3,700 feet in the white bars to plots below 3,700 feet in the gray bars. And you can see that both native and total plant cover is greater above 3,700 feet compared to sites below 3,700 feet. However, there is significant amounts of plant cover and native plant cover below 3,700 feet. Now at sites below 3,700 feet, there is greater non-native cover compared to native cover. So another question is, how does plant cover evolve over time? Well, there appears to be a shift in plant cover after a couple years. So now this figure is looking at total native, non-native plant cover, but now I'm looking by age class, not just above and below. I have enough sites that I can break these into classes of landscape age: 1, 2 to 3 years, 4 to 5 years, 11 to 12, 21 to 24, and then greater than 50. Those are sites above 3,700 feet. And with total plant cover, you can see there's kind of a shift after 3 years, where you reach total cover of greater than 60% at 5 years. And then they're very close. I want to clarify, these bars, white bars are native plants, gray bars are non-native plants in terms of mean cover of these plants. And in these early years, there is relatively high non-native plant cover in the flood zone sites, but that rapidly decreases after 1 year. And by the time you get to sites that are 5 years old, you have this really high bump in native plant cover that reaches about 50% and stays there. Meanwhile, non-native plant cover is quite low after 5 years. Now, if we look at plots that are on terraced locations, the thing that stands out most with this shift after 5 years is all of a sudden at 5 years, there's this massive increase in cover of native plants. However, the cover of non-native plants decreases more slowly, but by the time you get to sites that are 21 to 24 years old, non-native plant cover is about the same as at those sites that were never flooded. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm just going to really briefly go through this. This is looking at plant functional groups. So thinking about plants as trees, shrubs, grasses, forbs, which are wild flowers, and crust, so biologic crust. And now this is also looking at, these bars represent different age classes from 1 year to greater than 50. And one thing that's very interesting is biologic crust, cryptobiotic crust, is present on these emerging sites after about 5 years. And in fact, there's a greater cover of crust on sites that are 21 to 24 years old compared to sites that were never flooded by Lake Powell. Forb or wildflower cover, they appear to be an early colonizer, then decrease over time. Shrubs have relatively low cover in the early years, but increase to a peak in shrub cover at 21 to 24 years, and then slightly lower shrub cover as the landscape matures on these landscapes that have never been flooded by Lake Powell. Tree cover, unsurprisingly, is greatest at sites above 3,700 feet compared to sites below 3,700 feet. However, there was similarity in cover to sites that were exposed for only 5 to 6 years. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about vascular plant richness. So this is a very simple measure of plant diversity. This figure here shows native and non-native and total plant richness. Again, the white bars represent sites above 3,700 feet and the gray bars sites below 3,700 feet. There's greater total plant richness above 3,700 feet compared to below. 109 vascular plants were observed at sites above 3,700 feet to 88 vascular plants observed at sites below 3,700 feet. Also, native plant richness was greater at sites above compared to sites below 3,700 feet. And there was the non-native plant richness was slightly greater at sites below 3,700 feet compared to those sites never flooded by Lake Powell. And finally, I just want to show with this graph that you see this nice kind of gradual increase in vascular plant richness, both native richness and total richness over time. With non-native species, you see a trend towards a peak in non-native richness with kind of intermediate age sites. And then finally, I know I'm pretty much out of time, but I'm just going to really briefly go through a couple images from 50 Mile Canyon and the Escalante drainage. These are this time series of 2 years. So the images on the left were taken in 2022, images on the right in 2024. Also listed are the elevation and the number of years this landscape has been exposed. And these were taken at approximately the same time of year. So it's kind of controlled for stage of vegetation growth. And one thing I want to point out here in the 2022 picture, you see the remnants of a beaver dam, which is great, beavers are there. And in 2024, you can see how that beaver dam's presence and then degradation facilitated an increase in these wetland grass species, that it caused some sedimentation and allowed more substrate for these plants. You can see the growth of Gooding's willow in the background. Here along this stretch that was exposed for 5 years in 2022, the big change 2 years later is you see cottonwoods have grown by maybe about 10 feet, so that those are about 20 feet tall. Now at this site that's been exposed for 11 years, for the most part, you don't see a lot of changes here. What you really see is just the growth of that single cottonwood. You can see it's grown taller, the crown has greater breadth to it. In 2024, that cottonwood was probably 40 to 45 feet tall. And then finally, one of my favorite images of a restoring hanging garden. Of all the hanging gardens I've seen that are in kind of this restoration zone, this is really the most lovely and most diverse of those hanging gardens from Cottonwood Gulch. It was exposed 11 and 13 years. And really the big change you see 2 years later is there's just increased growth of algal growth and moss growth on that wall of the hanging garden. And while you can't see it in this picture, I did observe an increase in species richness there. And with that, I'd just like to thank support from Glen Canyon Institute, the NOAA CAP program, and all of those who have helped me in the field. Thank you.